Velkommen til Krimfestivalen. Mitt navn Hilde Sandvik, som nå sitter her med en som har skrevet det som blir betegnet som en himmel for en bokelsker, en himmel for en bokorm. Rett og slett Peter Swanson. Welcome here, Peter Swanson. It's so nice to see you here.
Thanks for having me.
What I just said now in Norwegian is that you have written a book that is described as a heaven for a bookworm. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think so. I've heard that. It's all about a bookseller in the book world and a used bookstore. So all things I love. So easy to write, or not easy to write, but a pleasure to write.
I must say, because you've written a lot of mystery stories, but this time it seemed, Eight Perfect Murder. If we're gonna say a little bit about what it is this mystery aficionado who has written this. He has compiled a list of 8 perfect murders. And how did that idea come about in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's a slightly different book than other books I've written, in the sense that the way I got the idea was, and this was a kind of one-off situation for me. I was out taking a walk. This is a couple of years ago. I was walking around a very beautiful pond, Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, kind of a famous pond. And I was working on a short story, and I was thinking up, I was trying to come up with a really clever murder idea for that short story. And so in my head, I was going over books I'd read that had really clever ideas for murders, clever ideas to get away with murders. And then all of a sudden I had this thought, well, what if someone compiled a list of these best murders in fiction? And then immediately following that was the second thought, which is, what if someone else used this list to commit actual crimes? And it was like the book fell into my lap. And I was walking, so it was about an hour walk. And by the end of the walk, I pretty much knew the entire book. I knew who wrote the list. I knew who was using the list to commit the crimes. I knew a lot of the books on the list already, and I knew the sort of whole unfolding of the plot that has never happened to me before in a book. It would probably never happen again. And it stayed pretty true. Of course, then I had to go back and write it. So it wasn't like you instantly have a book. But it was an exciting thing to have happen.
But because when I read it, I had the feeling that this was a book that you really had to write. That I had this idea that it was an intriguing idea, and you just had to let it happen.
Well, I think as soon as I had the idea, I did have to write it. And I think it became a very personal book for me because it's so much about reading. The act of reading and what that means to you. And Malcolm, who is the narrator of the book and a book fanatic and a mystery fanatic, is in some sense, in many senses, very much not me, but in some senses, including his reading history, his love of particular types of books is fairly autobiographical, which is unusual for me. But I just got to delve into this whole world of reading and writing, and especially doing the research for this book, because I was trying to compile this list of perfect murders. I got to reread a lot of books that I loved and read a lot of new books as well.
And I can see I saw a cat behind you. And of course, when I sit here now, I think, where is that cat from?
I know.
After reading the book, you tend to ask all these questions.
This is not Nero. This is she's very annoyed that I woke her up. As she should be. Yes, I do. I think I have a cat in all of my books. And I am a fan of cats, and my very own here, who often pretty much, where I'm sitting here is pretty much where I write. I often write on the couch. And my cat is pretty much next to me all the time when I write. So I'm sure some of her influence came into the book.
But Nero is also kind of a little person in this 8 Perfect Murders.
I was very
isn't she or he?
Yeah. I mean, initially I knew that the major setting of the book is a used bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts. I have known a few bookstores that have store cats, and so I instantly knew that this store would have a cat. And then at some point in the book, I realized that the cat has a little more significance than just being a store cat. So, but I won't talk about that.
No, of course not. We're not going to reveal anything.
We're not going to do spoilers,
here.
Despite the fact that the book has a lot of spoilers for other books in it. I've been told this. I
guess it has.
Yeah.
And of course, this intriguing question is there anything as a perfect murder? Is it possible to get away with a perfect murder?
What's funny about the book, I think there are some very clever ideas in the book. I'll just pick out one, which is the Murder from Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, is this very unique, interesting murder where two strangers who both have someone they want to kill swap murders so that, in the book, one of the men kills the other man's father and the other man kills the man's wife, and they'll be away at the time, and because they have no connection together, they'll get away with it. It's very clever. I actually think it's a terrible idea because you're basically handing someone all this power that they know what you did. I mean, it's something that's inevitably going to go wrong. And what's funny, so in fictional murders, most of them turn out not to be perfect because most mystery novels have a detective that eventually solves them. That's not always the case, but it's often the case. So they're not perfect. And in real life, I suspect murders are not similar to the books that we read. They're messy and vicious and often spur of the moment. And also, and if there have been some perfect murders out there, we wouldn't know about them, of course.
And of course, I mean, a lot of murders will never get solved. So in that sense, you could say that there is a certain kind of perfect murder. But I've seen that you've called a perfect murder almost as the same thing as a very perfectly roasted chicken, for instance.
Maybe in terms of writing one as opposed to in terms of doing one. But yes, I think it is. I think it's just like a perfectly roasted chicken is they say it's the test of a chef, because it's a simple thing to do. And yet there's so many, little details that you have to get right. So it's similar to that. Again, I'm speaking as a writer and not a murderer. Not a murderer. I just want to make that clear. So.
It's very comforting to know that, even though we sit on a distance, so I don't feel threatened by it.
We're very distant.
But the thing is that, I mean, this writing list thing, this Malcolm Kershaw, he writes lists, but you do as well. I've seen a couple of the lists that you've been writing. So it seems as if you like to somehow compile things and to list them and to structure them into categories. Is that something you do with other things as well, or is it just crime?
No, I do it with, say, movies. I mean, I have a running tally of the top 10 films of every year that I just write for myself. And it actually goes back to 1934. Not that I was alive in 1934, but I have, I go back and watch movies from different times. I think the need to categorize art, which I think a lot of people have. I don't know if this is
especially
true.
Men, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and I do believe it is a male characteristic. It's probably not exclusively a male characteristic. So I think some of it is. Some of it is a sort of a bragging rights type of thing. It can be that way, that like, I'm going to defend these things that are the best. I think for me, starting when I was quite young, it was a way of defining myself, because I was a youth that fell in love with books and movies very young. So, and when that happens, you're just you're not falling in love with something that you're participating in. It's not like falling in love with football. So I think it was a way to participate in it. So, you know, to be, you know, a 12-year-old that loved mystery novels, to then come write a list of what I thought were my favorites that I'd read, was a way to participate in that process. I'm not sure I totally understand that idea, but I think it applies to Malcolm as well. And I think he talks about that in the book. But that's how I think about it. It was a way of, you know, putting myself into that world very young.
Do you disagree with Malcolm, or is that his list your list of 8 perfect murders?
I basically agree with Malcolm's list. I don't necessarily agree with Malcolm's choices in his life. Again, I won't talk about that. But early on in the book, I've often had characters in other books that talk about movies they've seen or books they love, and I often try and come up with different books and movies than what I love, because they're characters and they wouldn't have the same taste as me. With Malcolm, I started doing that early on. I started to think, well, he might really love this book that I'm not a fan of. And then at some point I said, no, actually, in terms of taste, Malcolm is me. Everything that he says he likes in the book is something that I personally, as an author, like. And I just made that decision at some point to do that. Yeah.
And there is, there's certain vibe of Agatha Christie in this, of course. And you put Agatha Christie in there. ABC, Mord etter alfabetet, I think it's called in Norwegian.
Yeah.
And this whodunit is, I think, a lot of traditional crime readers that search for or long for these whodunit stories. And you put a lot of those into this crime novel as well. Yeah. Do you somehow long for kind of more old, traditionally written crimes these days?
I've always been attracted to what I think of as golden age mystery, classic whodunits, country house mysteries, locked room murders, things like that. These days, sure. I mean, I think they're comforting in a way. I think they're always comforting in a way, these books, partly because they bring you back to a different time. They're not related to world events that are happening now. They might also bring you back to the time when you discovered the books, which was, I think, for a lot of people in childhood. So if you discover, Nancy Drew or Agatha Christie as a young reader, I do think there is comfort in going back to those. What I wanted to do with this book, when I had begun to conceive it, because it was referencing so many classic whodunits, I realized that this book should have elements that I don't always put in my books, more old-fashioned elements of whodunits. So I think this book has, it has clues, it has red herrings, it has the reveal of the murderer at one point. Like, it has a lot of what I think of as the tropes of classic whodunits, as opposed to trying to write something that's a contemporary, a new spin on old ideas. This has got a lot of classic elements.
And it's a puzzle in a way, and to have a puzzle in front of you and to piece it together, it is also a way of feeling that you can control the world. And I was thinking about that when I listened to you now, that this, in a time where we don't feel that we have control of anything, at least I can understand together with in the plot, you start to understand things that it gives you the feeling of controlling something, structure something. And that is also comforting.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it goes beyond that too, with a lot of classic mystery novels, especially with detectives taking center stage, is that the beginning of a mystery novel is the world is thrown into chaos. Usually by a murder, and a murder that no one knows who's done it and could they murder against. The world is in chaos, and by the end of the book, a detective has come along and put the world back into order, which is a very comforting thing and reveals the total truth, so that we know exactly what happened. There isn't this remaining mystery. So I think there's probably a reason why traditionally there have often been religious figures like ministers, or there's Father Brown, and there's like the Grantchester series in England where like a minister solves the crime, because there is something almost religious about it, like this person is going to set the world to rights. So these are all comforting things, and yes, you're absolutely right. Right now is it's obviously 2020 was a terrible year. I feel like 2021, maybe we're seeing some light. I don't know. Hopefully,
we don't know.
Hopefully. And, but I think we're all seeking, the comfort of fiction. And, for many of us, comfort of fiction means the comfort of crime fiction. So.
Yeah. And you have written a list about comforting literature during a crisis. I did,
didn't I? You're not going to ask me to remember those names I gave.
I not all of the list, and do you remember anything of it? Or perhaps you can even come up with a new list here and now.
Let me think what I put on that list. I do think Agatha Christie obviously is very comforting. And I often think, and it's not just, dark fiction can be comforting too. If for nothing else, it takes you out of yourself. If a book is doing its job, which is, as you're reading it, you are no longer having your everyday thoughts, but you're completely in a world where you're worried about fictional characters and living in a different place. And even if it's something like Silence of the Lambs, a dark serial killer book, if you're entirely trapped in that world, it is comforting in the sense that you're no longer in your world. And also, oftentimes, if the problems are so much worse for the characters in the book, it does make you feel better about your life. Like they're in a scary situation, and yet you're tucked up at home, comfortable and safe, and that can be comforting as well.
Yeah, that is actually the old Greek concept of catharsis.
Yes.
That somehow you can get your own dirt out through other people's works.
Absolutely. And it can also be, I think there's been a lot of popularity of fiction that now explores the minds of killers and anti-heroes. And I write a lot of that as well. But sometimes it's fun. There is a cathartic thing about maybe being brought into the world of a character who kills someone out of revenge, say, something that you wouldn't do yourself, but that maybe you fantasized about, and it allows you access to another world. And right now, not only are we trapped in the world that is not of our making, but a lot of us are trapped in a very small house. That doesn't change. So reading is a great way to get out of it. And, I know there's endless Netflix shows, and I watch plenty of them. But there is something about being lost in a book that is really transportive in a way that even television or movies can't quite be if you really get trapped in a book.
It's transgression. It's transgressing in another sense, because when I look at something on the screen, it's on the screen.
Yeah.
But reading is like opening up some other rooms, because I have to think them out myself.
Right.
It has to kind of evolve there as a real world almost. And then but also the mind wanders. And when I read your 8 Perfect Murders, and I read about the wife who died, Malcolm's wife, and I don't know if you meant anything about it, but suddenly she turned up in my head like in the form of Lisbeth Salander. Of course, she might has nothing to do with it, but it still struck my mind as a picture.
Well, that's interesting because, again, that's the difference between reading and watching a Netflix series. Is if you're watching a thriller on Netflix, or anything on Netflix or anything on television, you're being told what they look like. And here your mind has to tell you what they look like. And it's a different, I think it's harder to get into a book. If you're tired, you tend to want to turn on the television and have something quickly beamed onto you. It's a little more work to get into a book, but once you're in it, it's better. And I do think that process, I was not personally thinking of Lisbeth Salander when I wrote that character, but I can see it. I can see where you would have come up with that. And who knows, maybe I was on a subconscious level.
Yeah, under a spell.
Of course, of course. Most writing happens under some sort of spell.
And in this eight perfect murders, of course, we don't know who gets away with what here. But this FBI character that suddenly knocks his door, because this guy, we can tell so much, can't we? That this guy, he sits back home and an FBI agent knocks his door, and she has come up with some very interesting thoughts. And that's where it starts.
Yeah, so she's the stories, he's written this list, and he's forgotten about this list. It was 5 years ago, and on a snowy morning in Boston, an FBI agent arrives and says, well, I have this theory, and the theory is, it looks like a certain number of unsolved murders might be corresponding to this list. So she's come to him for help. I suspect she's also coming to him to take a look at him as a suspect. And I did think when I was creating Gwen, the FBI agent, that in a different type of book, she could be the lead. And we could see the story through her eyes. But as it is, we see it through Malcolm's eyes, and it makes for a very different type of story. But yeah, that's
because I was wondering about that, because when I Googled 8 Perfect Murders, it was listed as a series, and I thought perhaps that is not right. But if it's gonna turn into a series, perhaps we can see Gwen again.
Oh, that's interesting. Amazon, for whatever reason, and they've never done this before, when they posted my book, said it was book number 1 in the Malcolm Kershaw series.
Yeah.
Which was odd, especially if you've read the entire book. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mentioned it to my publisher over here, and for whatever reason, Amazon won't change it. And now they're worried if Amazon changes it, it changes the algorithm or something. It's like Amazon is, who knows? But I do get an occasional question from someone saying, is this a series? So I like it's not a series. At least I have not come up with an idea for a second book. But I guess I don't mind the idea that people might be misled by the possibility that this is a series. So it doesn't bother me that it says that. Gwen might show up in another book. I do like to carry smaller characters across my books. So Gwen has a better chance, I think, of showing up.
Just the last question. What have you been writing in the last year?
So I have a book that I have just finished the first draft of. It slides into what we've been talking about a little bit, which is it's a modern uptake or retelling of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I was sort of interested in the idea of how do you trap people together in a modern setting with cell phones and all this. And I came up with an idea to do it where they're not on an island, they're all separate, but it's a number of people who show up on a list together who have no connection and then start dying off on that list. And that's what connects them, but they can't figure out what they have in common. So it's sort of a modern Agatha Christie retelling, and that's what I've been working on.
It's a new puzzle.
Another puzzle.
Thank you very much, Peter Swanson, for talking to us. And for alle som sitter og ser på, så kan jeg si at det mulig å gå rett inn på krimfestivalen.no, og der ligger der intervjuer med 50 forfattere. Det bare å ta for seg.